I should probably put a voiceover here for our sponsor. Nah, you can read.
It's time.
What's up, ladies and gentlemen? I'm here with John Danaher, Mr. John Danaher. How are you doing tonight, sir?
Very good, thank you.
Okay, let's talk about it. Gordon Ryan had a phenomenal night tonight, one that tested him a couple times, majorly, but he prevailed in outstanding fashion. Talk to us a little bit about what the game plan was for tonight.
You can never really game plan too closely for a round-robin tournament because there's a certain lack of certainty as to where things are going to go as the night progresses. The big surprise for us was the first round Rustam Chiziev was eliminated, and I think that was, in retrospect, the new laws, the new rules with regards overtime really worked against Rustam. So we were surprised by that, and Craig Jones, of course, we've faced before in ADCC and seen him in previous EBIs. The only question was to what degree had Mr. Jones improved his performance, and of course everyone's working hard to improve, and he showed tonight fantastic performance on his part. Dramatic improvements in his early matches, a lot of quick submissions, similar to ADCC where he was able to get quick submissions, and he's got a tremendous propensity to go into his attacks with confidence and verve and technical prowess. Very impressive, and he gave Gordon a sharp, hard match in ADCC, and we expected another one here tonight.
Did you expect to see him in the final?
Yes, the real question, who's going to get to the finals on the far side of the bracket? Would it be Rustam or would it be Craig? And as soon as Rustam was eliminated, we were expecting Craig, yeah.
So was there any other things that surprised you? Because I wonder what it's like to watch EBI from your perspective. I know that there is a coaching perspective. Is there ever a fan perspective that takes over, or an entertained moment that you have when you're watching somebody else and you're like, Gordon's he's fine?
Absolutely not. If I had any kind of fan mentality, I wouldn't be doing my job. So no.
There's never a moment. There's never something that like gets you up out of your seat.
No.
Because I wondered, everybody got up out of their seats with the match, with Craig and with Gordon. Talk to us about that armbar escape, because he said in his post-match interview that he drills that and trains that all the time. Was there ever a moment of worry for you in there, or do you just train it so much that you're pretty confident in this?
You must remember these are situations that we train almost every day, so we know the limits of what can and can't be done. You must remember that the people he trains with are also just as good at arm locks as he is. So it's nothing on an average day in training to see Gordon in those situations up to 20 times. As long as the athlete keeps moving in purposeful directions, the arm is usually pretty well protected. The only time I get worried is when I see an athlete just stop moving. When there's not a sense of purposeful direction, that's when, okay, there's probably going to be a submission now. But as long as there's, it's like in boxing, as long as the head and the feet are moving, you're probably going to be okay. So too with submission escapes, as long as there's purposeful direction in ways that free the trapped limbs, you're going to be okay.
I like hearing that. Speaking of purposeful sort of direction, you were part of an all-star team with George St. Pierre for his return.
Yes.
You were talking a little bit after, because you elaborate this on your Instagram posts, and you were saying that it was one of the more difficult things you've seen him have to do. Elaborate to some people who may not understand what that is, or why it was so difficult to come back, especially in terms of the weight cut as well.
Yeah, the act of comeback is inherently difficult in itself. Think about in other combat sports, great athletes who came back. Probably the most well-known comeback in American boxing history would be Muhammad Ali. Coming back after a forced hiatus, I believe it was around 3 years. And he had 2 warm-up matches, I believe it was 2, and then a championship match, which he lost. Even for one of the greatest boxers of all time, coming back was very, very difficult. His first 2 performances out of the box were not good at all. You had Sugar Ray Leonard, who had two great comebacks. Well, one was great and one wasn't. He had a great comeback in a highly competitive fight against champion Hagler, and it was a great match. It was a controversial match, but he came back and he did win. I know there's a lot of controversy on that, but at least it was highly competitive against one of the great boxers of all time. However, he took another hiatus, and it was less than 4 years. And the second comeback was the beginning of the end, and it didn't go well at all. So, as a general rule, in the history of combat sports, comebacks typically don't work so well. There's some exceptions to this. You'll see someone like Floyd Mayweather had several retirements, but he was only gone for 18 months, 2 years, and he was training the whole time. And they were really what you would call a professional comeback. They never really intended to retire when they announced a retirement. They were going to come back. So the history of combat sports shows a very mixed bag, most of it slightly negative with regards to comebacks. It's an inherently difficult thing to do. In the case of mixed martial arts, it's even more difficult because mixed martial arts is a very young sport, which is progressing extremely rapidly. There was other complications too, obviously. It's one thing to come back. It's another thing to come back in a completely different weight category against someone you have no experience with. So the fight camp itself had to be managed very carefully. How are you going to get a welterweight, and not even a particularly big welterweight, to be honest with you, to spar with 185-pounders? It's not the match alone which is the concern. It's also the training time. You got to get a guy who normally weighs around 190 pounds, sparring people who normally walk around at 210 pounds, and the injury risk goes up. There's a when you get hit, you tend to get hit harder. Okay, it's hard on the body. So those are simple concerns, and then everything got thrown through a complete loop by the emergence of abdominal pains about a third of the way into the camp. It was a fairly short camp. It was a 6-week camp, which after a 4-year layoff that's a short camp. Now the good news is George was in good shape before he began the game. He's not one of those guys who gets out of shape when he's
phenomenal athlete all around.
Yeah. So it wasn't like sometimes a guy takes time off and the first thing I do is make him lose weight.
Right.
Okay, it wasn't like that, but he started experiencing severe abdominal pains and a host of other symptoms, which for the sake of politeness, I don't want to gloss over, but the symptoms were a real mystery. So about 2 weeks into the camp, George had to completely and utterly curtail training. Done. Nothing. That lasted 2 weeks. The situation was so critical at one point that on a Friday evening, myself, Faraz Sahabi, and George had an emergency meeting where basically we said, if you're not training by Monday, you got to pull the plug. There's no going forward. At this stage, where time is very, very tight indeed. And I don't throw words like heroic around very lightly, but George showed a good degree of personal heroism. I thought he came back on a Monday. He had a great grappling workout. He grappled with Jake Shields, Gordon Ryan, and Gary Tonin, and he looked good. But then he had one of the worst shoot boxing or kickboxing with takedown workers I've ever seen him have the very next day. So now we're right back in crisis mode. It's like, okay, this is probably the most important part of the fight, and it's not looking good. But I'll give that kid credit. He just clawed his way back in. He's one of those guys who never complains. When he's in pain, he just will not talk about it. And he trained all the way through those last 2 weeks. And I will say, with each progressing day, he looked more and more like the old George St. Pierre. The ambition, our ambition as trainers, was to have George weigh in heavier for a fight at middleweight. That was the idea. So he was force feeding himself through ulcerative colitis, which I don't know if you know anything about that condition. It's an extremely painful and potentially lethal condition. Thankfully, if it's caught early, it doesn't go away, but you can control it. You can keep it under wraps. And at that stage, early tests revealed nothing. They didn't know what it was, and it was just this mystery illness. People thought everyone thought it was food poisoning. Obviously, the symptoms didn't match up with that. And there was a good deal of mystery. No one really knew. So at 2 weeks, George was back in the gym. He progressed day by day, and he never told us about what he was going through. He said, yeah, I'm better. Then the day of the fight, I remember he went to the bathroom and didn't come out for like 2 hours. Didn't say a word. I didn't say anything to him because I knew he didn't want me to know. Mm-hmm. Because George has a fear that if we think he's ill, we will corner him differently than if we think he's healthy. So but I didn't say a word. He didn't say a word. But he went out. It was a great fight. It was when you think about it, if you look at the career of George St. Pierre, what are the three most persistent criticisms of George's legacy? Too much control makes for boring fights. Doesn't finish fights. And he never fought up a weight class. Okay, what did he do in that fight? It was one of the most dramatic fights of all time. Finished his opponent, who was a champion in a weight division above him. So he answered the 3 principal criticisms of his career in one fell swoop. It was an amazing performance. Bisping is he's one of those guys who consistently flew under the radar of people's assertions of who's a great UFC fighter. He won more fights than anyone in history in the UFC. A fact which everyone has glossed over is that fight was to determine who was the winningest fighter in UFC history. If Bisping had won it, he would have gone further ahead. If George won it, he would have tied Michael Bisping for the most wins in UFC history. He did. So now George and Michael Bisping sit at the top, but George, of course, has defeated Michael Bisping and has far fewer losses. But this is a guy who had so many wins in the UFC, and yet people consistently say, oh, this is an easy way to get the middleweight champion. I used to laugh when I would hear that. I was like, if you think Michael Bisping is an easy fight, you're out of your freaking mind. So it was a tremendous performance by George. As I said, there was a lot of personal bravery and just mental toughness that got him through what was one of the most difficult camps from a physical perspective that I've ever seen. I've seen great camps, I've seen terrible camps, and this one was different. I've never seen medically compromised camps. I've never seen that. And so it was a tremendous relief to see him come through and put on one of the great performances of his career.
I'm so curious between you and Freddie and Frost, when you get in that room, what is that conversation like? Do you pick their brain in the same way they might pick yours? Like, I understand there's a mutual respect, obviously, that has to exist, but it's a pretty good all-star team if you're putting one together.
Well, when we get together in the room, we mostly just talk about sex and violence. Yeah, that's pretty much it. It's always a fascinating thing. I'm obviously deeply interested in the idea of elite coaching. Freddie Roach is one of the great coaches in boxing history. It's always impressive to see the quiet professionalism in Firas Zahabi, Freddie Roach, and so many other great coaches too. A coach that never really got the credit that he should have got in Jordan's career were his wrestling coaches at Montreal Wrestling Club. They too are these are people who prepare athletes for Olympic and World Championship competition. There's a big difference between a guy who coaches for pleasure and a guy who gets people ready for an Olympic event. Okay, there's a big difference. And that kind of quiet professionalism with someone who knows what they're doing, doesn't get emotional, doesn't make rookie errors. You see that with Freddie Roach, who gets the biggest boxing fights of all time. You see it with Firas Zahabi. You see it with the Montreal Wrestling Club. It's just a pleasure to be in the same room as these people.
Well, something is coming up next. I believe Gary Tonin is looking to do MMA. Now, are you conflicted here in the sense that you are his coach, but you also like to see Gary get punched, I'm sure. So are you conflicted in the sense that you want him to do well, but you also want to see him get punched?
Oh, my God. He's putting words in my mouth. I was conflicted, when Gary and Gordon expressed interest in MMA, part of me is you guys are doing incredibly well in grappling competition. And grappling is really starting to take off. For the first time, athletes are making livable money. They can make a living doing grappling. And you guys are, you're at the top of the food chain right now. So initially my reaction was, well, do you really want to do it? Is this something you really want to do? I mean, MMA is it's a very different kettle of fish from grappling. I think a lot of grapplers have tried to make the switch and found out it's not easy at all. I've seen many grapplers spar with MMA athletes in grappling and say, oh, this must be easy, I killed that guy. And they go into a situation where they're getting punched in the standing position, and it's a very different kettle of fish. But they expressed a deep passion and interest in it. And when I saw that, I said, you know what, let's get this done. If we're going to do it, let's do it right, and let's get prepared. So I'm 100% behind them now.
Well, I like that. That's great. I'm glad that you talk some sense into them, because they don't have a lot of sense. True. So
I think my students are extraordinarily good at grappling, but common sense, not so much. Yeah.
I want to ask this because it's important that people know you guys have had a tremendous year. We're at the end of the year now. This is one of the last events the team's doing. Can you put into some sort of short summary? I feel I should give you a 100-character word limit, but can you give us a summary of how you feel about this year for your team in particular? No?
Short summary.
Yeah.
Me.
Hey, listen.
What are you, an idiot?
It's not even an idiot. I just want to give you a challenge. You like to put your athletes through challenges. I very rarely see something as specific as you have 100 words to describe how this year was to you. Now, we'll have people at home count how many words, but I'm just intrigued. So can you describe in 100 words?
Fucking awesome.
I don't know why more of your Instagram posts just don't have that. You should just not write anything and just be like, fucking awesome. When you put up today's post about Gordon,
I'll go with that one.
go with that. I think that's a way better one.
That's good business advice. Yeah.
Great business advice.
No, it's been a fantastic year. I'm immensely proud of the seniors and the juniors on the team. They've all. I will tell you now, some of the juniors we are coaching are just making incredible progress. They will soon, I'm quite confident, over the next 2 to 3 years will become household names, just as their seniors above them have. The big shift is some of the seniors are now going into different sports, mixed martial arts, gi competition, etc., etc. So there's going to be a diversity in training, which will be very interesting for me next year, because we've had such a focused form of training on no gi, submission grappling, submission wrestling. So for me as a coach, it's going to be very, very interesting. For the past year, I'm just immensely proud of their achievements. Gary Tonin had an amazing year. Gordon Ryan, incredible year. Eddie had some physical issues this year, but he's coming back now and looks immensely strong. His game looks as good as ever. I think he'll do very, very well at the next EBI. So we're reflecting on a very successful year, one that I'm very, very proud of the accomplishments of my students. But this is a sport where the moment you start congratulating yourself, everyone just races right past you. So tomorrow we head back to New York, and Gordon Ryan and Gary Tonin will be back in the gym training. Gary for mixed martial arts, and Gordon Ryan for the new Keisai tournament, fighting very, very tough Yuri Samoy.
And when does he start after that? Does he start with gi? I know he's mixing it in here and there.
We'll probably start gi in the new year. The only potential problem here is I'm probably going to have to get a knee replacement. So that may complicate things a little bit. Also, the decision as to whether or not George St. Pierre is medically able to come back or not, that's uncertain at this point. If he is physically capable of coming back and fighting Mr. Whitaker, then I will obviously not do the knee operation. If he's not, that would give me a bit of a breather to do a knee replacement. So we'll see. Things are a little uncertain as to where they'll go right now.
Well, we always love catching up with you. We love hearing these things. I did want to close with this question because you were starting to answer this question in one of our first interviews. And I was asking you a question, kind of making a joke about why you call people Mr. Gary Tonin or Mr. Eddie Cummings. And we went somewhere else with it. And people online were very angry. We never got the actual answer. Like, they hit me up and they're like, how come we didn't get the answer? So can you tell us right here, why do you refer to them as Mr. Gary Tonin, Mr. Gordon Ryan, whenever you are addressing them?
You mean typically when I'm coaching, I typically refer to them by Gordon Ryan I've always believed that the notion of a coach is a delicate balancing act. On the one hand, you want some kind of familial closeness. Okay, you guys travel together, you train together, you see each other every day in the gym. But on the other hand, the moment you start getting too close to people, you start getting emotional as a coach. Okay, and the moment you get emotional in this game as a coach, you're on the road to failure. There's times that I have to call upon them to do things which are potentially harmful. Okay, if I'm emotional about this, I won't call for that. Okay, so there's a delicate balancing act between closeness and distance. If I call them Gordon, day in, day out, Gary, okay, it's like they're my brother, my friend, okay, and the distance starts to break down, and you start seeing them as a friend. But I might have to call for them to break someone's leg, to sacrifice some element of their arm and get out of a losing situation. So there has to be distance, but it can't be too much distance. If it's too much, if it's like, Ryan, do this, Ryan, do that, then I sound like a drill instructor. Right. And then when I come to call upon them, they're like, this guy doesn't even care about me. But I've always found, psychologically, when you call people by their full name, Gordon Ryan, Gary Tonin, Eddie Cummings, there's a sense in which that you have that first name familiarity of closeness, but surname distance. Okay, and so you at a subconscious level, you work that idea of distance and closeness in the correct fashion. Can't be too close, can't be too distant. Somewhere in between. If it says, hey Gary, how you doing? Okay, we're buddies. I'm a coach, not a buddy. Okay, I'm going to tell you to do things that you don't want to do. So we're not friends. But on the other hand, it's not like, hey, Ryan, do this, do that. It's not like, I'm an uncaring, I'm
You're on tape here, sir, so I mean...
I better guard my words. It's not like I'm, an uncaring drill instructor who sacrifices his people like pawns in a game. And so I've always found when I refer to people, there's a subconscious sense in which if I use both of their names, I'm both close and distant at the same time.
Do you ever go the three names? Mr. Gary Stevens Tonin?
I believe it's Gary Lee.
Oh, is it Lee?
Yeah.
No one cares.
Yeah, and Gordon's middle name is that's a closely guarded secret, because if the world knew it, his career would be over.
It would be over.
Yeah. So
like Maurice?
Yeah, on that level.
Shit.
Yeah.
That's a pretty good guess for a
Definitely
blank one.
a career-ending name. Let's put it that way. So yeah, that's the reason.
Well, I appreciate that.
And Jim also, there's practical reasons too. There's two Ryan brothers, so
Sure.
I can't say Ryan do this,
Mr. Ryan
do
do this,
yeah,
then they start
yeah.
getting confused.
Yeah. But even when there's not that confusion danger, it has to do with subconscious thoughts about closeness and distance.
That's great. I'm going to put this in for the next time, but I want you to start thinking of this answer for the next time we interview. We're not going to do it today, but I want to give people like a cliffhanger, like television. Next time, we're going to ask you, why the rash guard always? But that's for next time.
There was a time before the rash guard, right?
I don't know you from that. But yeah, I know that exists. So we're going to go prequel on the next interview. So tune into our next interview, guys, because if you want that answer, you got to agree not to tell anybody else. I'm ready for it. Don't you? You got Gary Tonin over on the side trying to throw a water bottle and now acting, yeah, exactly. He shot me the other day. I want to point that out to camera members and people watching. Shot me. Where's the proof? My hurt soul is the proof, sir. No, but we'll put that as a plug for there. I want to say this, John. You're always so great with your insights. We always appreciate the approach that you give us, and we appreciate your time, my man.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure to see you.
Pleasure to see you again. Keep it locked here at VerbalTapcast.com for more information, guys.